Welcome everyone. We'll get started in about 1 minute. Welcome everyone. My name is Steve Stedman, and I'm here for a weekly broadcast called SQL Discussions with Stedman Solutions. My background, I'm the founder of Stedman Solutions. I started the company about 8 years ago, and we do a lot of SQL Server consulting work, programming. We have managed services to help people with their SQL servers, and we do a lot of performance tuning work as well. Now, today it's just me on the call, but we will be on future weeks having other team members join us. Currently, the Stedman Solutions team, we have 7 people on the team, and different skill sets. So depending on what it is that we're going to do, we may bring in different team members for different types of discussions. To kick it off this week, we've got 5 preloaded questions that people have sent in ahead of time, but feel free to shoot me your questions in the chat window if there's something that comes up that you want to ask about as we're going through this. As far as the topics of discussion, it's pretty wide open. Anything related to SQL Server, related to Stedman Solutions, related to Database Health Monitor, or the classes we offer, anything like that, feel free to ask. And we're going to do this week after week. So let's jump into it. Please bear with me. This is the first week doing it, so I'm still learning a bit of the process. And feel free to shoot your questions along the way if there's any questions you want to ask. The first question that was submitted ahead of time came from Jonas. And this question is, what is your opinion of hosting SQL Server data files via storage spaces direct on Windows 2019 Azure VMs? All right, well, that's a big question. I think there's a lot that goes into that. Overall, what storage spaces direct is there, that's really the ability to have shared storage directly connected in a type of hyperconvergence way with your Azure VMs or with regular VMs as well. And what it does, it allows you to do allows multiple servers to be able to connect to the same drive and use it. And one of the things is, if you're going to do SQL Server clustering with an Azure VM, that's one thing that can help with it, is having that hyperconvergent storage spaces direct storage connected. But also, I mean, it's one of those things that I haven't personally used myself. I've only read about it and looked into it. I've been doing a lot more work on AWS VMs recently rather than Azure VMs. But we have worked a lot with hyperconvergence, which is what Storage Spaces Direct is trying to do there. And with the clients we work with that have hyperconverged servers, they're some of the fastest servers that we work on with Microsoft SQL Server. On to the next question. And feel free to put any questions in the chat window if you're interested along the way. Next question comes from Bill, and the question is, are programmers and DBAs going to lose their jobs in the near future to AI like ChatGPT? Oh, this is a good question. Side note, I watched one of the, I don't know, it was about a 5 or 6 year old Terminator movie last week. And in Terminator, of course, if you've seen that, you know that Skynet is the AI that takes over the planet, and basically the goal is to destroy all of mankind. Well, I don't see ChatGPT or anything similar to that going the way of Skynet anytime in the near future. But I do see that it's doing a lot of really good things that are going to help people. And for instance, content writing, or even DBAs or programmers who need some help with programming. I mean, there's been a number of things that I've worked with where I'm working on a query and I know that this is a table name or this is a view or a DMV I'm going to use, and instead of going to Google to refresh me on it, I'll go to ChatGPT and ask for some help. And it's a really handy tool to use. But I kind of think of it a lot like years ago, like around 30 years ago when I worked at Microsoft. Was when Visual Basic was introduced. I remember Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer up in a big presentation where they were showing Visual Basic, this new development environment. And this was before, I think it was before Visual Studio even existed. Well, it certainly was. And all we had back then, I think, was Programmer's Workbench or something for writing code. But what it did, or the presentation of Visual Basic back in the day, of this quick ability just to throw programs together, people started to ask the question of, with a program like Visual Basic in 1990, roughly, is that going to make it so that we don't need programmers anymore? And here we are 30 years later, and yeah, Visual Basic sure did not make programming go away. And I think that ChatGPT is going to be very similar to that. I think that it's real good if you can ask it the right question at generating good content or good code for you even, or samples. But it makes a lot of mistakes, and you've really got to be smart enough. If you're going to use something like ChatGPT, you've got to be smart enough to know when it's lying to you. And you might find that out simply by copying and pasting some code and throwing it in a management studio and trying to run it. And that's a quick way to see that ChatGPT is not doing the best job if it doesn't work. But it does a really good job on some things as well. So I think it has a heck of a long way to evolve before it gets to the point that it's going to make it so that DBAs or programmers are going to lose their jobs. But I also think that it's one of those tools that if you don't learn it and don't pick it up along the way, somebody else will, and it may give them a step up or may give them a little bit more information when they're programming than you have. For instance, I mean, imagine, I know I use Google all the time, and I have for a long time on searching for anything. And I know that when I'm doing that, or when I use Google, it's something that it's just a tool I use. It doesn't make me a better DBA or better programmer in any way, but it does help me find things quicker so that I don't have to remember absolutely everything that there is to remember about SQL Server and all kinds of programming. And I think that ChatGPT is going to help in that area so that I think it's just going to help overall to give programmers and DBAs more tools to get their job done. But as far as taking their jobs away, yeah, I really don't think that it will. Anyway, that's one of those things that there's a lot of varying opinions out there. And I was talking to an older retired gentleman a couple weeks ago, and he seemed to think that ChatGPT was going to, and this, of course, he just learned from like mainstream media and all that, but his thought was that ChatGPT was going to take away the jobs of anyone who's ever written a book or written poetry, or it's even going to be able to replace creativity and the ability of like newscasters and stuff like that. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's a great tool. It's not there yet. It's got a long way to evolve. But it's a pretty cool tool, and hopefully we can all make use of it to make our jobs a little bit better or a little bit easier. All right, this next one, kind of a longer question. And before we get into this, just a reminder, if you're watching and you have any questions or comment, feel free to post them in the chat window. Well, I guess I should check the chat window to make sure nobody's posted. There we go. All right. So this next one is, they wanted to get my thoughts on SQL Server Audit if one was tasked with setting up auditing of SQL inserts, updates, and delete activity on a permanent basis due to regulatory requirements. Should we start with SQL Server Audit or go with extended events? And this came from M. Cook, and it's a good question, and that's one of those things that I would want to understand a lot more before I just blanket statement said, yes, you should use this or you should use that. But I think there's pros or cons around using the different tools. I think SQL Server Audit is a great tool for tracking, and it will indeed track inserts, updates, and deletes. And you can even do that with extended events. You can set it up so that it'll track insert, updates, and deletes. And with both of those, you can set them up so you can track them for a single database or a single user, a single server they're connecting from, or even for single tables or any kind of granular detail like that. But the big question is, what are you going to do with the information once you track it? So I I hope that if really you want to track every insert, update, and delete, that it's not a very busy system. Because if it is, you're going to end up with more auditing data than you have of data in your system to begin with. And what I mean by that is most systems you do lots of selects, and of course there's no mention of logging select statements there, but there's lots of inserts that happens, lots of updates and lots of deletes that happen throughout the day, and as that happens, your database grows, but you might have dozens or even hundreds of updates on some rows as things change. So for instance, take a client record. It might be that their phone number or their address or things like that are being updated. And over time, there's a lot of those kind of updates occurring. And how are you going to want to track this, or how are you going to want to report on this? And it sounds like it's for regulatory requirements. But if somebody comes to you and says, 10 months ago, we want to know who changed this record in this table on this specific day, or even on this specific week, how are you going to store all of that data for an extended amount of time, and what are the regulatory requirements for how you're going to do it? And it might be that you're just storing it in a bunch of files that you can go back and walk through later, but hopefully you're storing it somewhere that you can query it and use it, or maybe you've got a way to import that and use it when you need it. But I think that without more detail, I can't tell you that SQL Server Audit or Extended Events is going to be better. Generally speaking, I mean, Extended Events has had a lot more enhancements over the last several years, but then there's been a few enhancements on SQL Server Auditing as well, on filtering and things like that. So my take is I would first look at Extended Events, see if it'll do what you need it to do, see if the output from it can then be stored or queried in a way that you can use it in a way that you're going to go back and be able to report on those auditing things. But really, they're both great tools, and I think Extended Events is probably way more flexible overall. But you just want to be careful that the amount of the amount of tracking you're doing with either of those, you want to be careful that it's not so great that the amount of auditing overloads the amount of work that's happening on the SQL Server. It's possible that if you turned on enough auditing on inserts, updates, and deletes, that it could easily double or triple or even more the amount of I/O or work or load that's happening on your SQL Server. So you want to be really careful with what you're doing there, and with where where you're going to log that as well. Okay, so a couple of questions in the chat window we'll take a look at. I cloned one of the VMs with SQL Server, already renamed the VM to a different name. Team already has taken down the original box out of our domain now. I tried to log into SQL with a new name, but it's not working. Oh, that's a great question. With that, I mean, one of the things you want to make sure, I mean, you've and I've done this where you've cloned a VM and you rename it, and I would look at what's going on in the SQL Server log at the time you're trying to log in and see how far is it getting in the process. Is it getting there but the user's not working? Is the SQL Server properly registered? One of the things that you need to do after renaming a virtual machine is you typically also need to rename SQL Server so that SQL Server knows what it's known as internally. I forget the record or the command off the top of my head, but there's a way that you tell SQL Server what the server is named. It's one step beyond changing or renaming a VM. And it might be that. It might be something to do with the SQL Server listener if you're working on a named instance. Or sorry, the SQL Server browser if you're working on a named instance. But it's one of those that, it's just going to take some troubleshooting to track that down, but I think looking at the SQL Server log is a great way to figure out where it's going there. And on that point, I mean, it's one of those things that, I've been through that. I've seen it happen. I've got some scripts that I would look up and use from the last 2 or 3 or 10 times that I've renamed a VM. But it's one of those things that if you needed some help, we do have a SQL Server mentoring package where you can buy a few hours of time and we work together on fixing things like that. But I would also try, and I'm curious, on your SQL login, are you using it as an actual SQL Server login? or is it a Windows server login? It could be that maybe the server is not registered on the domain correctly, and Active Directory resolution is not working too. So, but that's one of those things that I need a little bit more information there, but I'd want to check the SQL Server logs to make sure everything's looking okay when that happens. The next question is from Scott McFadden. Hey, Scott. For money-saving purposes, VM or SQL licensing, what's your thoughts on undersizing memory or CPU, the cloud, in the cloud disaster recovery SQL Server until you fail over from on-prem, and then scaling up the DR SQL Server after that? That's a great question. So, disaster recovery is one of those things that everybody wants, but nobody ever wants to pay as much as it really costs usually to have true DR that's an exact match of your primary. The thing I think about here is, and I've done this, where we'll be doing whatever method for moving the data to the cloud to a failover machine, and with that, we keep that failover machine pretty small because it's only there for true disaster recovery, and we keep it just small enough that in the event the primary system failed, and this isn't just like a SQL reboot type fail where it's going to come back on in a few minutes, but in the event that your primary had a catastrophic failure, you're going to turn on that secondary site for DR. Well, the time involved in, and that's what you want to look at depending on the environment, there may be different times in what it takes to size that machine up. But if it's something that you can size up the memory and size up the CPU very quickly, that's a great thing to save on the overall DR cost by keeping that SQL Server small until you need to fail it over. Now, the other question is, how often are you failing over that? Is your system pretty stable, and maybe it's just the once every 15 years you have to fail over to it? Or is it something you're failing over to weekly? Hopefully your system's stable enough that that's not the case, but that's something to keep in mind too. But really, what are the failover requirements that you have from the business too? I mean, if the business failover requirements can be met while you're taking the time to size the VM up at the time of failover, great, go for it. But if that needs to be a big enough virtual machine that at the time of failover it can take 100% of your load without skipping a heartbeat at all, well, that's a different scenario. So it's really understanding the requirements, understanding the things around it, so that you can figure out what's the right solution for the business needs. Now, I've done exactly what you're describing there, and it's worked well. And it's even worked well when we've had a failover for up to 24 hours. And then what we've done, we've failed over in an environment like that, ran for, it wasn't quite 24 hours, but we ran through till the next evening. And then at that point, we shut the failover site down, resized the VM, and then brought it back online as our new permanent primary at that point. All right. From Voodoo, said, thanks, Steve, in regard to the first question. Hopefully, Scott, that answered what you're looking for there. The next question, and I like this one, it's from Fabrice NG. What causes a page in SQL Server to become suspect? Entry in the sys.suspect pages page, and though CheckDB and CheckTable finds no errors. Okay, this is good, because the suspect pages table, sys.suspect pages, I don't know. I think it's a bit of a misnomer in how it's used or how it's presented. And really, and I've done a lot of database corruption repair, and I've dealt with a lot of CheckDB errors, a lot of CheckTable errors, and a lot of overall just really corrupt SQL servers in order to repair and bring them back online. But from suspect pages, my experience is the only time you ever see anything in suspect pages is when you're doing a restore of a database that has corruption in it, and there's a corrupt page that's on that restore, and that gets logged in suspect pages at the time it's being restored. I have never seen CheckDB at the time you're running CheckDB on an existing database write anything to that table, and I've done a lot with CheckDB. So You can test this. I mean, if you have a database that's corrupt, you could back it up and restore it, and it would write into suspect pages. And in fact, short story around that. About 7 or 8 years ago, I did a thing called the Database Corruption Challenge, which I created 10 weeks of corrupt databases, and I put it out there to the public for people to try out. You download a corrupt database, and this all still exists. You can go try it if you want, but you download a corrupt database, you do a restore of that database, and then people can practice their skills at recovering corrupt databases. And one of the people who tried it out, because I didn't give enough warnings in the beginning, triggered all kinds of fire alarm type alerts on their system because he did a restore of the corrupt database into a production environment where they were monitoring the suspect pages table in order to know when they had corruption. And as soon as he restored that corrupt database, it put entries into that suspect pages table, and all of their IT staff got alerts that you now have a corrupt database on your system. Okay, first off, shame on that person. They should not have been doing that restore on a production database. That was just foolish to begin with. I learned after the fact, whenever I make a corrupt database that someone's going to use, I tell them, don't even think about doing this on your production system. Do this on your desktop or on a dev box or something like that. But suspect pages shows up. It could be... Okay, back to your question though. What causes it to show up even though CheckDB and CheckTable find no errors? Now, it might be, and this is what I've seen quite a bit, is that you see something in suspect pages and it might have been there some time ago, and somewhere along the line, something has been done to fix that corruption. Either the database that was restored that threw the data in there maybe has gone away. Somebody may have run CheckDB with some of the repair options, which can be dangerous. Or maybe it was in a table that's part of like a data load process where the table gets truncated and rebuilt daily. I mean, things like that will clear out corruption. Or it might be that it was able to, when it did the restore, I'm just trying to think. So at the time the database was restored, it wouldn't have done anything to repair the corruption, but someone may have run CheckDB to fix it after that. So hopefully that answers the question about suspect pages, and glad someone asked about that, because that corruption and corrupt databases is one of my favorite topics. All right, nothing new in the chat window, so going back to one of the questions. Oh boy, there is something new in the chat window. Scott McFadden, have you ever seen antivirus cause issues or corruption with SQL Server? Yes, absolutely. I don't remember the name of the antivirus software that was being used. It was, it was antivirus and endpoint protection, and it was one of those that scans all I/O that's happening on the server. And this was a client, I'd worked with them for many years. I still work with them. But they had about, I think the database was about 1.5 terabytes in size. And they started getting corruption. And we worked together and we got it cleared up real quick like. Some preliminary corruption, and then it kept happening like a week later. And what was happening was this antivirus or endpoint protection was somehow messing with the I/O that was going on there, and it kept corrupting things. Now, what was fortunate was that it did not mess with the I/O on the transaction log backups, and we were able to do a corruption repair, because it was all over the place on this database. We were able to do the corruption repair by doing a full restore of the database. This was while the original one was running. We restored a copy of it, and then we restored differential backups, and then we restored all the transaction log backups on that server, going through the time that the corruption occurred up to the current point in time. We shut the primary server off, switched the primary database down, renamed the other database to be the same as the original one, and they were back up and running, and the corruption was removed. Because the corruption was only written into the data files, it wasn't being written into the transaction log files, which was awesome because it gave us an ability to do a fairly inexpensive recovery there with 100% data recovery. So that was a good thing to have those backups in that case. So yes, absolutely. We did end up turning off, well, in order to prove it. I mean, that was a tough one to prove because we couldn't entirely prove for sure that that was that antivirus software or endpoint protection causing it. But what we ended up doing, because they'd had 2 or 3 corruptions by the time we figured this out, we turned that off and set it up to exclude all SQL Server data and log files. And then it stopped having corruption, and I think, gosh, it's probably been more than a year now since that happened, and they haven't had a single corruption since then. Now, additionally, on that same environment, that was super high-end hardware, and if we had been on like a cheaper or older SAN or something that was maybe 5 or 6 or years older, I might have suspected the hardware a little bit more, but this was a system we knew really well that had pretty rockin' hardware, and I wasn't ready to point the finger at the hardware yet, but we turned off that antivirus and endpoint protection and then figured out how to configure it correctly, and they've never had corruption since. So hope that answers that one. Yeah, I would really be careful when you're putting, I mean, I'm all in favor of antivirus and endpoint protection. I think it's important for your business continuity in the event, doing what you can to prevent ransomware and other viruses and things like that. However, it doesn't necessarily need to scan all of your MDF and LDF files, because that can get that can cause problems. All right. On to the next question that was submitted ahead of time, submitted from Stan. What's your opinion of the new Microsoft Fabric announcement? And this is one of those that was announced last month, not something that I was super familiar with, but it brings together a lot of like machine learning and reporting and different types of data lake together. And because my focus is typically on core SQL Server, I don't really go into that space too often that Microsoft Fabric covers. However, my opinion is it looks pretty darn cool, and if I was to take on some kind of a machine learning project or that type of thing today, I would certainly consider it and try it out. It looks like it's a big improvement. It's using a lot of the same tools that have been there, but it's a big improvement, kind of bringing them all together in a more seamlessly integrated environment. I don't know, not a great answer to that one, but a little bit outside of my my wheelhouse there. The next question is, we are currently running SQL Server 2012 and planning to upgrade. Okay, good news. You should definitely upgrade if you're running 2012 or anything older. Maybe even 2014 or 2016 too. But the question is, should we go to SQL Server 2019 or SQL Server 22? And the question came in from Angela. This is a great question, and gosh, I said that about most of the other ones except for the Fabric one. But the reason that this is, there's a lot of things to consider here, and my gut answer is usually, unless it was a version that was just released like last week, usually my recommendation is to go to the newest version that you can. But there are some occasions where you may not want to do it. So first let me talk about why I'm going to say go with 2022. So the newer version will have a longer support period of mainstream support, and it will buy you more time before you're forced to upgrade next time. And depending on the environment, I mean, you might be in an environment, well, I guess obviously if you're on 2012 still, you're not in the cycle of upgrading to every version of SQL Server as it comes out. But to jump from 2012 to 2022 would not be a bad jump. There's a number of things, though, I would consider with it. And there's a lot of great improvements in SQL Server 2022. And even on 2019 over 2012, there's a lot of improvements, too. So they're both a big upgrade. But where I would consider 2019 would be if the applications that you're using are not compatible with or not acceptable with SQL Server 2022. And I know a lot of people out there are using off-the-shelf or products that come from a specific vendor rather than like a homegrown product. But I guess the same thing applies even with a homegrown product. But if you have a vendor who is telling you that our software has been tested for compatibility on this version of SQL Server, So for instance, with Database Health Monitor, when I launch it, I tell people Database Health Monitor is regularly tested on every version of SQL Server from 2005 up to 2022 at this point. I know it works great, I know it works good there, but that's not the only program you're running. But your vendor of whatever applications you may have may tell you that we're not ready for 2022 yet, or we haven't compatibility tested, or we think it'll run great, but nobody will support it if you're on 2022. And I've heard a lot of different stories from different people about things like that. And there's some people that I know that they did an upgrade recently and they went to SQL Server 2017 because that was the newest version of SQL Server and this is the year 2023, but that was the newest version of SQL Server that their vendor would support. So a lot of factors that go into that. I would also look at what things or what features have been deprecated or changed between the different versions of SQL Server. And if you've got a homegrown application that you use, that may be a tough thing to find out. But I know there is the SQL Server, what is it called? The SQL Server Upgrade Advisor. Pretty cool program that Microsoft makes that you can point it at a SQL Server or database, and it will scan it, and it will tell you, it'll scan it, and then you tell it what version of SQL Server you want to go to. You can say 2019 or 2022, and it will analyze that database and figure out, are there things going on in that database that will be incompatible with that newer version of SQL Server. And you can even use it for Azure databases and things like that. What it doesn't do a good job of, it does a great job of analyzing all the code in the database, all the stored procedures, functions, things like that, but it doesn't do, and it really doesn't have any insight in this, it doesn't do a great job of analyzing inline queries that are coming from applications, whether it's a .NET application or a desktop application and things like that. So it might be that that application may be using features in a query that are not compatible with specific versions of SQL Server like that. So my answer is generally go with the newest version you can, unless it was literally released last week. As long as you do enough checking to make sure you've got compatibility there, and as long as you have your vendor support for whatever version you're going to there. All right, well, that's it for all the questions that we had ahead of time, and we've got a number of questions in the chat. If anybody has any last questions, I'll give you a minute or two more here. But I just want to point out here, if there are no more questions, for things like corruption on SQL Server, or whether it's suspect pages, which is related to corruption, or these other things, that's something that we do a lot of work with at Stedman Solutions. And if you think you've got corruption, or you think you have a problem, you can schedule a free 30-minute chat with me through the Stedman Solutions website to be able to go and talk about what you've got going on with corruption, or what you've got going on with specific issues like that, and to determine, is this something that we could give you some advice on? Is this something we could help with? Or is this something that we could just tell you how to go fix it? Sometimes I've seen with corruption, 10-minute phone call and they've got it resolved, and other times it's been as many as, as long as a week to be able to do full corruption repair. So, but we're always happy to have that conversation and see what we can do to help, and sometimes point you in the right direction. So, if there's no other questions at this point, I want to thank everyone for participating. I think we've got a total of 7 people attending, and we're going to try and do this every week on Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Pacific or 4 p.m. Eastern, except for 4th of July. United States holiday is coming up in a few weeks. We'll probably skip it on the 4th of July, but unless there's a holiday, we're going to try and do this every Tuesday. And you can submit your questions ahead of time, or you can tune in for the live stream each week, and we're happy to take any kind of questions that people want to ask at that point. All right, if there's no other questions, that wraps it up. Thanks for watching, everyone. Have a great day.